Dear professors, dear students, dear colleagues, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this academic event entitled The Mortara Case Between History, Philosophy and Theology, jointly organized by the Ecumenicum, the Institute for Ecumenical Studies of the Angelicum, and the Cardinal Bea Center for Judaic Studies of the Gregorian University. And I would like to thank particularly Professor Massimo Gargiulio, Pro-Director of the Bea Center, who first conceived the idea of this event, and our three scholars who responded to our invitation, namely Professor Marco Cassuto Morselli, Professor Matthew Tepi, and Professor Elena Mortara. We are deeply honored by your presence, and we look forward very much to listening to your valuable contribution. I must confess that I knew very little about the Mortara case until last year when I saw the film Rapito by Marco Bellocchio. And in this film, I was particularly shocked by the attitude, at least as it is portrayed, of the Dominican Inquisitor of Bologna, Pier Gaetano Felletti, who was in some way at the origin of this case. And in a way, I'm glad that the Dominicans are continuing to reflect on this question, even if it is, of course, in a very different way. Indeed, some Dominicans have been pioneers or have played a key role in the contemporary Jewish-Christian dialogue. Among others, I would like to cite the names of Bernard Dupuy, the founder of the French Episcopal Committee for Relations with Judaism. He was also my predecessor as director of the Istina Center in Paris. Father Pierre de Contenson, who was the first secretary of the Vatican Commission for Jewish-Christian Relations, and also the Dominican Remy Hoekman is a successor in this position, who was also the founder at the Angelicum of the Ecumenical Section in 1983. Not to mention Father Yves Congar, who was, as we know, one of the drafters of the Declaration Nostra Aetate. I trust that our seminar, which will look at the historical, philosophical, and theological aspects of the Mortara case, will contribute in its own way to this dialogue. And in this hope, I thank once again all of you for your participation, and I wish you a very fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Dear colleagues, dear students, dear audience, when Professor Tepi proposed that we organize a meeting on the Mortara case and how it could be related to Thomas Aquinas' view on Jewish parental authority, a topic to which he has dedicated his important forthcoming book entitled The Mortara Case and Thomas Aquinas' Defense of Jewish Parental Authority, I replied to Professor Tepi that the Cardinal Bea Center program was already set and quite full. However, considering the significance of the topic and the scholars' expertise, we agreed to explore the possibility of holding the meeting nonetheless. This possibility materialized thanks to the interest of the Angelicum, particularly through the rector, Father Joseph, and the director of the Institute for Ecumenical Studies, Father Destivel, whom I thank, along with Dr. Dimitrios Keramidas, and of course our secretary. The synergy of our institution, the Cardinal Bea Center of the Gregorian University, and the Institute for Ecumenical Studies here at the Angelicum, has made today's meeting possible, further enriched by the valuable participation of Professors Elena Mortara and Marco Cassuto Morselli. Thanks also on my part to all of you. The event of today allows us to address the Mortara case, recently gaining significant attention in Italy thanks to Marco Bellocchio's film, just mentioned by Father Desville, from three different perspectives, united by the conviction that this historical event still raises important questions for Jewish-Christian dialogue today. Many thanks, therefore, to the three speakers and to all of you. I'm waiting to listen with great interest to your talks. Thank you.
And our first speaker is Professor Marco Cassuto Morselli. Professor Morselli is president of the Federazione delle Amicizie Ebraico-Cristiane. He studied philosophy at the University of Rome La Sapienza, also at the Pontifical Gregorian University and at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He has taught Jewish philosophy and history of Judaism at the Collegio Rabbinico Italiano in Rome. He is the author of I passi del Messia per una teologia ebraica del cristianesimo, published in 2007, and he has edited also works of authors such as Elia Ben-Amozeg, Jules Isaac, André Chouraki, among others, and also recently edited the memorial of Edgardo Mortaro, Il Memoriale di Edgardo Mortara, which he will be his topic tonight. Thank you.
Grazie molto per questo invito. Se posso vorrei aggiungere un nome alla lista di padri domenicani attivi nel dialogo ebraico-cristiano, ed è quello di Bruno Hussar, fondatore a Gerusalemme della Maison Saint-Isaïe, che ho conosciuto bene, ed è stato importante anche il suo ruolo nel dialogo ebraico-cristiano, quindi mi fa piacere ricordarlo. La storia di Edgardo Mortara, 1851-1940, il bambino ebreo che nel 1858 non aveva ancora compiuto 7 anni, fu sottratto alla sua famiglia a Bologna per ordine di Papa Pio IX. Venne portato a Roma nella casa dei catecumeni, fu educato alla fede cattolica e poi diventò prete nell'ordine dei canonici regolari lateranensi. È stata riportata all'attualità e fatta conoscere ai più dal film Rapito di Marco Bellocchio, uscito nel 2023. Il bambino venne prelevato in quanto sarebbe stato battezzato di nascosto da una fantesca cattolica che lo credeva in fin di vita. A nulla valsero i tentativi della famiglia, delle comunità ebraiche di Bologna e di Roma e di altre comunità e organizzazioni ebraiche per riportarlo a casa. Il potere temporale dei papi stava vivendo i suoi ultimi anni e il rapimento del piccolo Mortara assunse un significato politico a livello nazionale e internazionale tra lo stupore di quegli ambienti cattolici che non comprendevano il clamore suscitato per qualcosa che si era sempre fatto. Nel 2005 la casa editrice Mondadori pubblicò un libro del giornalista Vittorio Messori intitolato Io, il bambino ebreo rapito da Pio IX, con il seguente sottotitolo: Il memoriale inedito del protagonista del caso Mortara. Il libro è stato pubblicato nel 2017 in traduzione americana. Nel saggio introduttivo Messori scrive che, cito, sono pagine scritte dal padre Edgardo Mortara in religione Pio Maria nel 1888, quando aveva 37 anni ed era in Spagna per il suo apostolato, da cui la scelta della lingua castigliana. Messori informa i suoi lettori che verso gli anni 30 del secolo scorso se ne fece sempre in spagnolo una versione casalinga, destinata a uso interno, diretta cioè ai soli membri dell'ordine. Vi si appose il titolo El Niño Mortara y Pío IX e come sottotitolo esplicativo in uno spagnolo che non ha bisogno di traduzione, narrazione autografa del caso Mortara scritta por el protagonista, reverendo Padre Pio Maria Mortara. E così apprendiamo che il titolo e il sottotitolo non sono di Mortara, ma sono stati aggiunti dagli editori e che la traduzione italiana del 2005 e anche la traduzione americana del 2017, che in effetti è la traduzione di una traduzione, hanno per base non il manoscritto del 1888, ma il dattiloscritto degli anni 1930. La presentazione del testo è firmata da Juan Oleaga, che è vissuto, è nato e morto a Oñate tra il 1922 e il 2008, allora priore della canonica di Oñate. Poiché negli anni 30 Juan Oleaga aveva tra gli 8 e i 18 anni, è evidente che il dattiloscritto non può essere degli anni 30. Dunque il testo non è stato redatto mentre Mortara era in vita, ma nei decenni successivi, dopo la sua morte. Da una ricerca effettuata presso l'Archivio Romano dei Canonici Regolari, che si trova a San Pietro in Vincoli, dei canonici regolari atenanensi, risulta che loro possiedono solo il dattiloscritto del testo, mentre il manoscritto sarebbe conservato nell'archivio della canonica di Oñate. Il manoscritto fino ad ora non è stato ritrovato, neppure in seguito alla richiesta inoltrata dallo stesso abate generale dell'ordine al priore della canonica di Oñate. Considerati tutti questi elementi, abbiamo ritenuto opportuno pubblicare una nuova traduzione del memoriale, che è questa, dove vedete non compare il nome dell'autore, perché c'è qualche dubbio che questo testo sia interamente stato scritto da Mortara. Quindi una nuova traduzione italiana del memoriale, corredandola di una nuova prefazione e di una postfazione scritta dall'abate generale dei canonici regolari lateranensi. E questo perché appunto non c'era nessuna intenzione di ritornare a vecchie polemiche. Riteniamo infatti necessario in primo luogo avere un testo più accurato, in secondo luogo rileggere il testo alla luce delle novità del dialogo ebraico-cristiano, iniziate, come sapete tutti, a partire dal documento Conciliare Nostra Aetate. Mettendo per il momento da parte tutti i dubbi sulla autorialità del memoriale, sulla corrispondenza tra manoscritto autografo in spagnolo e dattiloscritto in spagnolo, proviamo a leggere il testo così come si presenta. L'opuscolo di 89 pagine numerate si compone di 10 paragrafi e narra in terza persona, in modo piuttosto dettagliato, le vicende biografiche dalla precoce età del battesimo fino alla partenza da Roma nel 1870. Come tutti sapete, nel 1870 termina il potere temporale dei papi. E poi ripercorre solo alcuni eventi più significativi fino al presunto anno della composizione, il 1888. Il paragrafo Il battesimo non può evidentemente basarsi su ricordi personali del bambino, che all'epoca aveva 6 mesi. Nel paragrafo La separazione, Don Pio avrebbe potuto ricordare il suo dramma di bambino strappato ai genitori, il loro dolore e la disperazione. Al contrario, egli afferma solo che la Chiesa aveva il dovere e l'obbligo ineludibile di farsi carico dell'educazione religiosa del bambino. Quando i genitori finalmente riescono a rivederlo a Roma, nella casa dei catecumeni, l'imperturbabile bambino, cito, non emette un lamento, non versa una lacrima e lungi dal mostrare il minimo desiderio di tornare dai suoi afflitti genitori, anche per alleviare un po' questo profondo dolore, al contrario rabbrividisce e trema, rifugiandosi presso il signor rettore Don Enrico Sarra per ottenere la sua protezione. Fine della citazione. Un racconto che mostra un Edgardo divenuto ormai estraneo alla famiglia e che differisce di molto dal racconto di sua madre. Certo, altri hanno scritto di sé in terza persona, ma qui sembra davvero che Don Pio Maria sia diventato estraneo a se stesso nel trattare in questo modo vicende che hanno riguardato così dolorosamente i suoi genitori e la sua numerosa famiglia, estraneo al suo stesso vissuto infantile. Se queste pagine non sono state scritte da un altro, è Edgardo stesso ad essere diventato un altro rispetto a se stesso. Quando Roma venne liberata nel 1870, il padre di Edgardo aveva espresso il desiderio che il figlio trascorresse un giorno in famiglia, senza essere controllato dai superiori. Poiché questi si erano opposti ed egli si era appellato alle nuove autorità politiche, Edgardo si rivolge sul consiglio dei superiori al generale La Marmora, luogotenente del nuovo re a Roma. Cito, per chiedergli protezione e ausilio contro le gravi vessazioni alle quali rischiava di trovarsi esposto. Alla domanda che gli viene rivolta, vuole tornare alla sua casa? Edgardo risponde significativamente, no signore, non voglio, né devo, né posso. Una frase così significativa, senza virgole, che è stata scelta per la quarta di copertina. Nel Regno d'Italia la maggiore età si raggiungeva a 21 anni. Il ragazzo 19enne era pertanto ancora sottoposto all'autorità paterna. Per questo motivo i suoi superiori decidono di farlo fuggire all'estero e inizia il suo esilio, che tranne un breve periodo durerà per tutta la vita. Recluso nel più rigoroso incognito, assume il nome di Paolo Mazzarelli. Nel dicembre 1871 pronuncia i voti solenni, l'anno successivo viene trasferito nella diocesi di Poitiers, nel dicembre 1873 riceve l'ordinazione sacerdotale e prende il nome di Pio Maria. L'ultimo paragrafo del libro si intitola L'ultima parola e si apre così. Sì, dopo che tutto il mondo si è occupato della famosa questione Mortara, dopo che i gabinetti di tutta Europa, grandi e piccoli, amici e nemici, la stampa, la tribuna, i club, dopo che tutti, in una parola, tranne lo stesso Mortara, hanno parlato di un caso che riguardava così da vicino la sua persona, è giusto, opportuno e corretto che Mortara stesso dica l'ultima parola. Il nostro obiettivo, si noti il passaggio a noi, è quello di dimostrare in modo breve e sintetico che nel famoso sequestro del bambino Mortara, Pio IX, in qualità di capo della Chiesa Cattolica e vicario visibile di Gesù Cristo, ha usato il suo diritto e ha compiuto il suo dovere, basandosi sugli eterni ideali e sugli inalterabili dettami del diritto naturale e divino. Fine citazione. Ecco l'obiettivo dello scritto nella sua ultima redazione. La difesa di Pio IX. Oltre al genere biografico, nella filigrana della narrazione si intravede il genere apologetico e panegiristico. Come ha scritto Claudia Di Cave, in più punti la figura del protagonista viene quasi messa in ombra da quella del pontefice, presentato come salvatore del piccolo Mortara dalla cecità della religione in cui era cresciuto fino ai 7 anni. E come campione e martire che aveva lottato contro le forze demoniache a cui andava ricondotta la fine del potere temporale della Chiesa. Pubblicando una nuova edizione del memoriale, l'intento non è stato quello di rinfocolare vecchie polemiche, ma di affrontare una vicenda dolorosa che deve essere rielaborata in modo da rimuovere un ostacolo alle relazioni ebraico-cristiane. Ebrei e cristiani non devono avere timore di ricercare la verità storica. Il fatto, come dicevo, che l'abate generale dei canonici regolari lateranensi, Don Franco Bergamin, abbia voluto contribuire a questa pubblicazione con una sua postfazione è un segno di speranza. La vicenda Mortara va contestualizzata in un'epoca in cui il principio nulla salus extra ecclesiam, congiunto alla teologia della sostituzione e all'insegnamento del disprezzo, regolava i rapporti con il giudaismo. Oggi la politica conversionistica nei confronti degli ebrei è stata superata. Giovanni Paolo II a Magonza nel 1980 ha riconosciuto che la prima alleanza non è mai stata revocata e Benedetto XVI nel 2018 ha dichiarato, cito, «Una missione agli ebrei non è prevista e non è nemmeno necessaria. È vero, Cristo ha inviato i suoi discepoli in missione presso tutti i popoli e tutte le culture. Per questo il mandato della missione universale, con un'eccezione. La missione agli ebrei non era prevista e non era necessaria, semplicemente perché solo loro, tra tutti i popoli, conoscevano il Dio sconosciuto». Decostruire l'antigiudaismo cristiano, e qui cito un bel documento della Conferenza Episcopale francese, pubblicato l'anno scorso, Déconstruire l'antijudaïsme chrétien. Questo decostruire non ha niente a che vedere con il decostruzionismo, è una citazione da Jules Isaac. È un testo chiaro, coraggioso, che infatti è stato tradotto velocemente anche in italiano, pubblicato da Castelvecchi. Quindi decostruire l'antigiudaismo cristiano non costituisce un pericolo per il cristianesimo, ma al contrario una via di purificazione da quel peccato che ha provocato molto dolore agli ebrei e all'ebraismo e allo stesso tempo ai cristiani e al cristianesimo, in quanto ha allontanato il cristianesimo dalle sue radici ebraiche. Come recita anche il Catechismo degli adulti della Conferenza Episcopale Italiana, Israele è la radice santa dalla quale si sviluppa il cristianesimo e l'olivo buono sul quale vengono innestati i pagani perché portino frutto. Capitolo 11,5. La teoria e la prassi della conversione degli ebrei nel corso dei secoli ha causato indicibili sofferenze e soprusi. Attualmente, almeno in alcune chiese, tra le quali la Chiesa Cattolica, non vi è più un'attiva politica conversionistica, permane però l'idea di una conversione finale degli ebrei. Se per secoli i cristiani hanno atteso la conversione degli ebrei, nel nostro tempo, nostra etate, si sta iniziando a diffondere la consapevolezza della necessità di una conversione dei cristiani, non certo nel senso che debbano abbandonare la propria religione per diventare ebrei. Ciò che va abbandonato è il tradizionale antigiudaismo, che è fatto di pregiudizi, errate conoscenze, maldicenze e atteggiamenti di superiorità, come se per innalzare il cristianesimo fosse necessario abbassare l'ebraismo. Quando parlo di conversione traduco un termine ebraico importante che è il termine teshuvah, che è presente anche nel Nuovo Testamento. L'obiettivo del dialogo ebraico-cristiano non è né quello della conversione degli ebrei al cristianesimo, né quello della conversione dei cristiani all'ebraismo. Se la testimonianza delle nazioni non sarà più caratterizzata dal disprezzo, dalla maldicenza, dalla contestazione polemica, dall'invidia, ma dalla stima, dalla riconoscenza, dalla simpatia, tutti i gradi dell'amore. Se non annuncerà più l'esilio e l'asservimento di Israele, ma il suo ritorno, altra possibilità di traduzione di Teshuvah, e la sua liberazione, allora gli ebrei potranno vedere nel cristianesimo non una religione antagonista, ma una splendida fioritura messianica. Tra ebrei e cristiani sarà possibile un duplice riconoscimento. André Chouraqui ha scritto un libro sulla reconnaissance. E cito da Isaia 11,9, la terra sarà piena della conoscenza di Hashem, il nome impronunciabile, come le acque ricoprono il mare. Vi ringrazio.
Many thanks, Professor Morselli, for this presentation. You have not only clarified the circumstances of the redaction of the memoirs of Edgardo Mortara, but also illustrated the journey accomplished together since Vatican II in the Jewish-Christian dialogue. Thank you so much. And our second speaker is now Professor Matthew Tappy, Associate Professor of Theology and Director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies at the St. Leo University in Florida. His teaching and research interests are in the thought of Thomas Aquinas, Judaism and Christian theology, moral theology, and Catholic-Jewish relations. Among many publications, Dr. Tappy is the author of Aquinas on Israel and the Church, published in 2014. He is also the co-editor of the Challenge of Catholic-Jewish Theological Dialogue, recently published, I think, or forthcoming, and also the author of the Martyra case and Thomas Aquinas' defense of Jewish parental authority, recently published, or forthcoming also. And it is precisely, and this book will be the first book-length study to examine Aquinas' teaching against baptism of Jewish children against the will of parents in the 13th century context. And it is precisely on this question that Dr. Tappy is going to speak now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's an honor for me to speak to you this evening. I want to thank the organizers, especially the Cardinal Bea Center, for your graciousness and your receptivity and your openness to academic conversation on this topic, and especially also to the Angelicum for their gracious hospitality this evening. I want to begin just by framing a bit. We just looked at a historical analysis of Edgardo Mortara's memoir, correct? We did that. My approach is a bit different. I am looking at this topic theologically, and so while that takes into consideration history, it is also a theological analysis as well, and it's important to note the significance of the two approaches. Historically, it's very important to analyze the facts of the case and to look at what exactly happened. And yet at the same time, as you know, here at the Angelicum, theological study allows us to ask whether what happened in the past is faithful with the fullness of the Church's teachings or in accordance with the Church's teachings. And so, for instance, Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae is loaded with questions, where he is analyzing interesting questions. So that's the approach that I will take in this paper, and it will be mostly looking at Thomas Aquinas. Although the Mortara case remains familiar to many, in Italy, few may realize that the case continues to impact Catholic-Jewish relations and contemporary Catholic theology, since theologians in the United States continue to debate Pope Pius IX's decision. Indeed, scholars who defend Pius IX's decision and scholars who criticize Pius IX's decision frequently appeal to the teaching of Thomas Aquinas to make their arguments. However, the discussion has overlooked an important fact. The question of how Aquinas' teaching applied to this particular case was actually at the center of the dispute between the Mortara family and Pope Pius IX in 1858. Indeed, the Mortara family and the Roman Jewish community submitted to the Vatican a two-part document that appealed to Thomas Aquinas to argue for the return of their child. However, the Vatican's reply denied the request. They also cited Thomas Aquinas' teaching to argue that Edgardo Mortara's baptism was valid and that he therefore belonged to the Church. Who had the correct interpretation of Aquinas' thought? How do the authors of the Mortara and the Vatican documents interpret Aquinas' teaching against forced baptism? My presentation tonight is based on an examination of these documents from the Vatican archives. The documents are available in my forthcoming book, which is mentioned, and which is referenced in the handout that you received. Does everybody have a handout? Good. First, we will look at the Mortara family's plea. Then we will look at the Vatican's reply. My aim is not to evaluate Pius IX's decision, which was legal at the time. In fact, the laws of the Papal States encouraged Pope Pius IX's decision. My aim is to clarify the question of how Thomas Aquinas' texts were interpreted by both sides in the 1858 dispute over the child, and evaluate if their interpretations of Aquinas' thinking are correct. The family's plea quotes Thomas Aquinas in Tertia Pars 68.10. This is text 1 of your handout. The family quotes text 1 to argue that it is not at all the custom of the Church to forcibly convert non-Christians or to forcibly baptize children of unbelievers. They repeat Aquinas' teaching that since the baptism of an unwilling adult is wrong, so is the baptism of a child in vitis parentibus, which is interpreted against the will of parents. The family argues that if such baptisms take place, these are invalid because these lack the intention of the child's parents. In the family's view, the baptism was unlawful and invalid. However, the Papal Council's reply, we will look now at the Papal Council's reply to the family, also appealed to Aquinas to defend Pius IX's decision. First, the Council argued that 1, the baptism against the will of unbeliever parents is unlawful, as Aquinas and others argue, but this is irrelevant, because in Mortara's case, the baptism had already happened. In other words, the Council distinguishes between a lawful baptism and a valid baptism. They agree with part of the Mortara family appeal when it states that the Church has always been against forced conversions, and the Council even cites a part of Aquinas' teaching in Summa Theologiae Secunda Secundae 10.12. This would be text 2. They even cite part of Thomas's question there, 10.12. They say there is one emergency exception to this rule that is, quote, contemplated by all theologians and canonists, end quote. The exception is that the Church allows the emergency baptism of children of unbelievers if the child is near death in order to save the child's soul. Here, the Council implies that Aquinas has contemplated and permitted baptizing a child of unbelievers in vitis parentibus to save its soul, but they do not mention Aquinas' extended position against this practice. The Papal Council also brings up another point, point 2. They argue against the Mortaras that if a baptism of a Jewish child against the will of their parents takes place, it is nevertheless a valid baptism on Aquinas' terms. The Council says Aquinas assumes that the children of unbelievers would really be baptized if they were baptized against their will. As a proof of their point, they argue, based on text 3, Secunda Secundae 10.12, the same text from previous, that if the children of unbelievers were baptized against the will of their parents, then afterward, when such children mature, they might easily be persuaded by their parents to renounce what they had unknowingly embraced or received, and this would be detrimental to the faith. The third point argued by the Council is that it is not necessary that there be an intention to baptize the child in the unbelieving parents. And we have to also pause and say that with unbelieving in this term, we use this term to speak in Thomas's language of the Middle Ages, but we certainly wouldn't use this term to refer now to our Jewish neighbors. Rather, the Church supplies the intention. This is because a child is not baptized in the faith of its parents, but in the faith of the whole Church. The Council then cites Aquinas' teaching in support of this point in Tertia Pars 68.9. This is text 4. The text is from Thomas. The question is whether children should be baptized at all. And the Papal Council argues that the intention of the Church is sufficient for the baptism of a child of unbelievers to be valid. The fourth point the Papal Council addresses is the question of whether the baptized child must be returned. In reply, the Council argues that the Church has acquired a right over baptized children. The Church's right, according to the Council, is a higher right than the parent's right. So the lower right gives way to the higher right in order to honor God. To prove the point, the council argues that Aquinas says quite clearly that the parents would lose their rights over their children if children are baptized against the will of their parents, text 5. This is a quote directly from the Papal Council's reply, Brevis Sendi. This quotation is from Aquinas' Secunda Secundae 10.12. That actual text is in text 6. The Council interprets this text to confirm the validity of the baptism and the non-return of the child. The Papal Council's reply indicates that the question of Aquinas' teaching as it relates to the Mortara case is more complex than perhaps has been realized by contemporary scholars. In particular, contemporary scholars who appealed to Aquinas to criticize Pius IX's decision have not addressed text 6, just cited, which seems to indicate Aquinas thinks parents lose their rights over their children if the children have been baptized. Nor have they addressed text 3, that implies Aquinas thinks that if such baptisms occur, these constitute valid sacraments. Our analysis thus far indicates that 3 questions surfaced in the 1858 exchange, and these will guide our inquiry into Thomas's text, which we will take next, the next step. The 3 questions are as follows. The first has 2 parts. Number 1, whether Aquinas' teaching supports the position that Christians can offer the infants of Jewish parents against their will or without their knowledge for the purpose of saving the child's soul. And 1b, second part of question 1, the related question of whether the Church's intention suffices in such a case. Question 2, whether forced baptism of a child of unbelievers is nevertheless valid. Question 3, whether Jewish parents lose their rights over their children if they are baptized. So we now turn to Aquinas to answer these questions. As many are aware, the basic unit in the Summa is a written disputation, which is referred to as an article. The parts of an article include the question, objections, sed contra, respondio, and replies to objections. The sed contra itself is not the author's answer. It is commonly misinterpreted because it is usually in opposition to the list of objections which came before it. The sed contra usually reflects a rationale opposed to the objections, but it is misinterpreted frequently because it is similar to the author's answer. This author's answer comes in the next section, as many of you know, the respondio, but the sed contra is not the same as the author's position. Aquinas' answer only appears in the respondio and in his replies to the objections that come last. It is only in the respondio that we can determine accurately Aquinas' answer to a question. As I said, in his articles, Aquinas first considers objections. The first objection or question of our inquiry concerns the argument of the Papal Council that Christians can offer, i.e. baptize, children against their parents' will and without their knowledge in order to provide them with salvation. Aquinas indeed considers this view, but he lists it as an objection in Secunda Secundae 10.12. The objection is that it would be a sin not to baptize children of unbelievers, since these children are in danger of spiritual death. And this is text 7. Again, this is an objection, a position he disagrees with. Aquinas replies in text 8 by arguing that no one ought to break the order of the natural right, frequently translated in English interpretation, translations of the Summa as natural law should be natural right, ius. No one ought to break the order of the natural ius in which a child is in the custody of its father in order to rescue it from spiritual death. It should be noted that Aquinas encourages baptism of children in cases of urgency or danger of death, as did many theologians before him. But he forcefully rejects baptism of the children of Jews or other unbelievers without parental consent, even to save the soul of a child. In his respondio, or answer to the question, Aquinas explains why and says that the, quote, repeated proposals by some of his contemporaries to baptize the children of unbelievers, in vitus parentibus, against their will, are not at all reasonable, and he calls them hazardous. He says it would be dangerous to invent this new strategy when for centuries it had not been the church's custom to baptize the children of unbelievers against their parents' wishes. Again, the argument that the practice runs against the church's custom is in texts 2. In addition to this argument from the custom of the church, he also thinks such a practice is a danger to the Christian faith. And he also argues it is against the natural law. Indeed, the natural law argument takes up the majority of his respondio. Baptizing children of non-believers against the will of their parents, in Thomas's view, is repugnant to natural justice, which is another aspect of the natural law, as is natural right. Aquinas teaches that in matters concerning divine law, a person should only be persuaded to the faith, not moved by compulsion. This is, in part, why Thomas argues that before a child of unbelievers has the use of free will, it can be baptized only if the parents will this. Text 9. According to the natural law, then, the human person is directed to God by reason. It is through reason that a person comes to know God. This is why a child must be brought to God through the reason of its parents. Aquinas then elaborates upon why a child is, before having the use of reason, part of its parents by nature. He says that according to the natural law, a child is by nature not distinct from its parents in 2 ways. Text 10. Quote, "For a child is by nature part of its father. Thus, at first, it is not distinct from its parents as to its body, so long as it is in its mother's womb. And later on, after birth, this is the second sense, before it has the use of free will, a child is under the care of its parents, which is like a spiritual womb." Aquinas' usage of this metaphor, spiritual womb, echoes the way he uses the term uterus, or womb, to describe how an infant baptism is somewhat like carnal birth, in that children are dependent upon the action of the church for spiritual nourishment. In the baptism of children of Christian parents, children do not have faith, but they depend upon the church and the faith of their sponsors for nourishment, as they depended upon the womb of their mothers. That Aquinas would use spiritual womb as a metaphor for the care that Jewish parents provide their children indicates his high view of natural right as an order of the natural law that's established by divine providence. We will now take up the second part of the first question of whether Aquinas teaches that children of unbelievers can be offered. Recall that the Papal Council claimed that Aquinas teaches in text 4 on your handout. Aquinas teaches in text 4 that the children of unbelievers can be brought to baptism or offered. Does Aquinas teach in Tertia Par 68.9 that the representative will of the child baptized against the will of its non-Catholic parents should be expressed by the church and not by the unbelieving parents? The question of the article in Tertia Par 68.9, whether children should be baptized, states several objections. The objections reject the practice of infant baptism and answer in the negative with ancient but unsound arguments, like children have not the use of free will, and so they cannot receive baptism. It seems that children cannot be baptized, etc. All objections Catholic theologians would clearly disagree with. The concern of the second objection is worth highlighting, since it is Aquinas' reply to this objection that is cited by the Papal Council. The concern in the objection is that sometimes children who are baptized are children of unbelieving parents. But this unbelief, the objector says, would harm the child after the child received the sacrament. In reply to the concern that the lack of faith in unbelieving parents would prohibit a child from being baptized and receiving the sacrament, Aquinas cites Augustine's words in letter 98 to Boniface in the 5th century, text 4, and argues that it is not a hindrance to a child's salvation if their parents are unbelievers and have no faith. In this particular case, the unbelief of the parents is not a hindrance because the entire community of saints and faithful present the child for baptism. How can this claim be reconciled with Aquinas' teaching in the very next article, text 1, which asks whether children of Jews or other unbelievers should be baptized against the will of their parents, and it answers in the negative. Can Christians offer the children of unbelievers for baptism or not? As explained above, Aquinas teaches that it would be contrary to natural justice if such a child were baptized against the will of its parents. The context of Augustine's letter 98 is crucial for making sense of Aquinas' teaching in this passage. The context of Boniface's letter concerns parents who participated in pagan worship in Rome and their desire to have their children baptized. Around 408, Boniface reported to Augustine that a baptized child spat out the Eucharist with unusual gestures after having been offered to demons. The parents' participation in demon worship raised the question of whether pagan requests for their children to be baptized should be denied altogether. The concern could be summarized as, what good would it do to allow a child to be baptized and then raised in such an environment? Moreover, why would pagan parents want their children baptized anyway? Augustine's reply to Boniface's letter indicates that the parents actually intended that their children receive baptism. Text 11. The context of Augustine's letter is that the unbelieving parents actually bring their children to the church on their own accord in order to baptize them because they thought baptism would heal their children from sickness or retain good health. Even if parents present their children for baptism for the wrong motives, the Holy Spirit is still there, Augustine argues, working through the church to bring forth the children of God. What is important to note here is that though the pagan parents' intention for baptism of their children was misguided, their intention was for their children to be baptized. His intention here, Augustine's view, is that the church's intention suffices despite misguided intentions of unbelieving parents. Aquinas would have likely understood the context of Augustine's letter to Boniface, and this is perhaps why he sets the question on whether to baptize infants, 68.9, right next to the question on whether Christians can baptize the infant children of non-believers in 68.10. Perhaps he was aware that Augustine's mention of offering the children of unbelievers in the teaching of Article 9 could be misinterpreted to justify what Aquinas thought were novel and hazardous proposals for pressuring Jewish family to convert to Christianity. Therefore, in the context of reading Articles 9 and 10 together, we can say that Aquinas teaches that the church's intention can, of course, stand in for the infant children of unbelievers, as it does for Christians generally, but only if the unbelieving parents will their children to receive baptism. We now come to question 2, whether forced baptism of a child of unbelievers is nevertheless valid. Against the Mortara family's position, Aquinas thinks that if such a forced baptism of a Jewish child does occur, it is valid. Since Aquinas' teaching is that the baptized children would later reject the faith they unknowingly embraced when they were infants, text 3, this implies that Aquinas thinks that children baptized without the consent of their parents receive the effects of the sacrament of baptism, since how else would they be able to later renounce it? Aquinas' position is confirmed in places here in the Summa, as well as a commentary on the sentences. Finally, question 3, whether Jewish parents lose their rights over their children. We now consider this question. Aquinas sets forth an argument from the natural law here that nothing can be done to children against the will of their parents, which includes the claim that Christians cannot take away the children of unbelievers. Aquinas assumes that if a child of unbelievers is baptized in vitus parentibus, they would nevertheless remain with their parents. This is implied by the fact that he thinks that children who were receiving such a baptism would be persuaded later on by their parents and possibly lapse into unbelief, text 3. If Aquinas thought that parents would lose their rights over such children, that the children should be taken away, why does he seem to assume children remain under the influence of their unbelieving parents? Recall that the Papal Council cited a text of the Sed Contra in Aquinas' article 2 Secunda Secundae 10.12, that he seems to strongly indicate that Aquinas thinks parents of children baptized against the will of their parents would, quote, lose the rights of parental authority. The sed contra we are discussing here is in text 6. Now, it would be an injustice against the Jews if their children were to be baptized against their will, since they would, quote, lose all the rights of parental authority. Ius patriae potestas. From a cursory reading of this small part of Thomas's article, it seems Aquinas adopts the precedent of Council of Toledo 4, Canon 60, which teaches that an unlawful baptism of a child of unbelievers is nevertheless valid and should result in removal. However, such a misinterpretation of Aquinas' position is due to inattention to the style of the disputed question embedded in the structure of his article. As explained above, the sed contra can easily be mistaken for Aquinas' own position. However, it is inadequate on its own. The argument Aquinas places in the sed contra is the preferred argument against forced baptism of Jewish children in his time. The preferred argument is against forced baptism of Jewish children, but it also assumed the consequences that were sometimes applied to the coerced but valid baptisms of Jewish children in the 13th century, since it states that they would lose their rights over their children once baptized. But this is not Aquinas' position. The sed contra expressed the preferred position. Aquinas' position is similar to the text in the sed contra, but it is also different. Aquinas' position is similar in that he is also against the practice of baptizing the children of Jews against their parents' will, and seems to think that if such a baptism takes place, it is valid. However, his answer is very different in that he establishes the inviolability of parental authority for unbelievers over their children in the order of the natural law. His discussion spells out the consequences of this teaching clearly. Not only is forced baptism of children of unbelievers contrary to the natural law, but so is taking children away from their parents. Text 12, quote, it would be contrary to natural justice if a child, before having the use of reason, were to be taken away from its parents' care, or to have anything done to it if the parents are unwilling, end quote. When Aquinas uses the word subtraho here, taken away, it's the same word he uses for steal. It's the same word he uses in his discussion of vices against the virtue of justice in the second part of the Summa Theologiae, where he explains deeds that unjustly injure our neighbors. These include murder, bodily injury, and theft and robbery. In summary, those who appeal to Aquinas reject Pius IX's decision or have overlooked problematic and incorrect readings of Aquinas that have been used to support the removal. The critics of Pius IX have not realized that for Aquinas, if such baptisms happened, although unlawful and sinful on his terms, these would be valid. However, the defenders of Pius IX have offered deeply misleading arguments that claim that Aquinas' baptismal theology supports the removal of Edgardo Mortara. Not only is Aquinas against the sin of forced baptism of Jewish children against the will of their parents in order to save the soul of the child, which is a proposal he describes as against the custom of the church, hazardous and not at all reasonable, he is also against the sin of stealing children from their parents. Therefore, in Aquinas' terms, the act of forced baptism of Jewish children in vitus parentibus in order to save the child's soul and the separation would constitute a twofold sin. Although the baptism of a child in danger of death of non-Catholic parents against their will would be a valid baptism, it would be against the natural law, a hazardous departure from the tradition that is a danger to the faith, and, quote, not at all reasonable. This is why John Capriolus, the Prince of Thomists, who lived from 1380 to 1444 and won the title, Prince of Thomists, said in text 13, evils are not to be done in order that goods may come about, but an evil would be done by taking the little one away from his parents, to whom God and nature have made him subject. We have not had time to look at the reception history of Thomas's teaching in his Dominican Defenders from the 14th century onward to the 17th century, but it's quite extensive and interesting. And the documents from the archives from the Mortara family as well as from the Papal Council indicate that there's a much more elaborate discussion and debate in the Thomistic tradition about this topic. that's considered quite standard that Dominicans should comment on in their when they're commenting on the sentences of Peter Lombard. Aquinas' teaching has many implications for today's canon law, as well as for Catholic-Jewish relations. We don't have time to go into those, but I discuss those further in the work that's forthcoming. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you so much, Professor Tepi, for this very enlightening presentation, showing that the Dominican tradition is perhaps broader than that of the Inquisitor of Bologna, and illustrating also that the Mortara case raises not only political, juridical, and canonical questions, but also philosophical and theological issues, and we will certainly have questions after the last presentation. And we look forward, of course, to reading your book, which, as I said, will be the first book on this, on Aquinas' teaching against baptism of Jewish children, Invitis Parentibus. And our last but not least speaker is Professor Elena Mortara, Professor of Anglo-American Literature at the University of Rome, Tor Vergata. Professor Mortara edited, among many other books, the critical edition of the works of Philip Roth, and she also has recently published a book on the Mortara case, Writing for Justice, which was published in the United States in 2015 and awarded the European American Studies Network Book Prize. And as her name suggests, Professor Mortara is particularly associated with the Mortara case, since she is the great-great-niece of Ernesta Edgardo's sister, who witnessed the child Rapito at the age of 12 and was scarred for life. And the topic of the contribution of Professor Mortara is Victor Séjour and the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, a Catholic plea to the Pope. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, good evening to all of you. I wish to express my deep thanks to the Angelicum and its Institute for Ecumenical Studies, the Ecumenicum, and to the Cardinal Bea Center of the Pontifical Gregorian University for conceiving this small conference and inviting the three of us to participate. You mentioned Marco Bellocchio's film, Kidnapped, Rapito. Well, Marco Bellocchio, informed about the event, has asked me to transmit and share with you his thanks too. So here we are, Marco Morselli, Matthew Tepi, and me, the three of us being invited to discuss from a historical, philosophical, and theological perspective about the famous mid-19th century so-called Mortara case, the case aroused by the kidnapping, as you know, of the 6-year-old child Edgardo from his Jewish family in Bologna by the Inquisition in 1858, with all its historical consequences. Today's meeting is, I would say, historically quite relevant because the event is organized jointly by two pontifical university institutions, and as far as I know, neither these nor other pontifical institutions have ever promoted a public discussion on such a subject before. It was in Washington in the year 2017 that I debated publicly on the Mortara affair with other scholars at a conference where there was a panel devoted to the new light shed on the affair by book Writing for Justice. Victor Séjour, the subtitle says, Victor Séjour, the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara and the age of transatlantic emancipations. Which had been recently published in an innovative series in American Studies called The Mapping the Transnational. On that occasion, the title of my talk started with these words, cultures in contact. The issue of cultures in contact which is so typical of the Jewish diasporic experience, plays a central role in the topic we are discussing here. As a scholar of Jewish American literature and an Italian Jew, I am interested in the question of the encounter of cultures, which is a fundamental theme in the history of human relations, and this is one of the motivations that brought me to study the Mortara case from the viewpoint of a non-Jewish Catholic writer who was contemporary to those events. That is one of the motivations, though not the only one. As you have just heard, and as you can also see from my name, I am a member of the Mortara family, and I've always known of the Mortara affair because Edgardo, the child who was seized from his Jewish family in Bologna in 1858 and never given back to his family, was a brother, a younger brother, of my great-grandmother, Ernesta, on my father's side. And the history of that legal abduction and of its historical consequences was part of our family history, of our conversations and recollections. Yet, it was not this personal belonging, nor only my strong public opposition against the beatification of Pius IX in the year 2000 that propelled my scientific inquiry into the case. It was rather the discovery of an American-born writer that allowed me to reconsider the whole familiar story from a new viewpoint, opening new horizons of understanding on the multiple conflicts on stage in the Western world of the time around the explosive issues of freedom and equality. When the Mortara case broke out in the mid-19th century, side by side with the many pamphlets, declarations, and political initiatives that were taken in many countries as a reaction against the Vatican action, there was also a flowering of literary responses which resulted from the outrage produced by the kidnapping throughout Europe and the United States. It was, however, on the stage that the drama of the kidnapping found its most popular literary expressions, first in France, then in the United States, finally in Italy and other European countries. As a scholar, I found it particularly important to focus my attention on the first among the plays inspired by the case, the play by Victor Séjour, La tireuse de cartes, the fortune teller, in Italian, La cartomante or l'indovina, which was written and staged in Paris in 1859, only 1 year after the kidnapping, and was not only the very first and the most politically influential, but also the one written by a non-Jew, as I said, by a Catholic of American origins, who, despite his religious loyalty, declared he was writing in favor of the Mortara family. Who then was Victor Séjour? I have prepared a PowerPoint that we may see afterwards, maybe. So he was a free man of color, Séjour, born in New Orleans, Louisiana, in 1817, the son of a free woman of color and of a well-to-do mulatto man of Haitian origin from Haiti, both French-speaking. Those were not easy times for Afro-Creoles in Louisiana. In 1836, when he was 19, Séjour moved to Paris to complete his education after high school. He then remained in Paris and made his literary career, living as an expatriate there, becoming a successful writer and playwright. He first wrote poetry and a very important story, short story, called Le Mulâtre, the mulatto, about the tragic plight of a young mulatto slave in Haiti, which is considered the first story by an African American in the United States. Then he wrote many plays. 22 of them were produced in Paris between 1844 and 1875. My discovery of Séjour took place through my interest in his dramatic representation of the Mortara case. I was struck by the attention of this writer to the story of an Italian Jewish family grievously wronged by the Inquisition. What I found particularly fascinating and worth being studied was the partial crossing of borders that the experience of this writer undoubtedly exemplifies, and the outstanding in-betweenness of this figure in all aspects of his personal experience and identification. That liminality found expression in his linguistic identity as an American speaking French in New Orleans, in his racial identity as a free Creole of color from Louisiana, in his national identity for his crossing of national borders and living as a voluntary exile in Paris for most of his life, in his religious identity as a Catholic originally in a Protestant country, and in his writing, at least partially, for justice across religious borders when writing as a Catholic in defense of a Jewish family whose human rights had been violated by the Pope. The play by Victor Séjour, inspired by the Motara case, La Tireuse de Cartes, was put on stage at the Théâtre de la Porte Saint-Martin, a large theater which could host about 2,000 people, and its opening night took place on December the 22nd, 1859, in the presence of French Emperor Napoleon III and Empress Eugénie. This presence was interpreted as a sign that the play was promoted by the French court itself, and rumors in the press even suggested that the private secretary and chief of staff, chef de cabinet of the emperor, Jean-François Constant Mocquard, had contributed to the writing of the play. La Tireuse de Cartes was a great hit which ran in Paris for over 3 months until the beginning of April 1860, with an estimated attendance of 100,000 theater-goers. In La Tireuse de Cartes, Séjour does not put the Motara case directly on stage. He creates a similar situation, altering details and the protagonist's names, yet the affair, l'affaire Motara as it was called in France, and the issues it generated are clearly recognizable in this play, which keeps the essence of the actual story. A fictional change aimed at provoking more sympathy for the young victim concerns the gender of the abducted child, who is not a male like Edgardo, but a female. Her name is originally Noemi, but she is renamed Paula after her secret baptism. The play starts with a prologue where we are told of the secret baptism of a Jewish child made by the Catholic nurse, who then takes the baby to a convent for its being secretly adopted by a Catholic family. In the prologue, we also witness the dramatic encounter between this nurse and the desperate Jewish parents after their beloved child's disappearance. After the prologue, the following 5 acts of the play take us to 17 years later, dramatizing the knotted situation which has developed as a consequence of the kidnapping. The whole drama reaches its climax when the Jewish mother, who has meanwhile become a wandering fortune teller, La Tireuse de Cartes, or the play's title, finally finds her daughter, who is already a grown-up girl and a Catholic by way of her upbringing. So the reality was announced by this play. At this point, what is represented on stage is the struggle between the two mothers, the real one, the Jewess, and the adoptive one, the aristocratic Catholic lady, and the struggle within the poor girl's divided heart when she suddenly discovers the situation. Here is where La Tireuse de Cartes becomes a problem play. In the case of this play, the clashes revolving around the themes of contended motherhood, double identity, divided loyalties, and religious struggles. This is synthetically the plot on stage, but the play immediately had a written life on the page too. It was published by Michel Lévy Frères, an important publishing house, in two forms in 1860, both in their illustrated theatrical series, Théâtre Contemporain Illustré, and as a book. And in both cases, before the play's text, Séjour added a powerful preface which contributed to the campaign against the child's kidnapping that was still heated in France, as elsewhere in the Western world, over 1 year after the kidnapping. In this passionate introduction, indeed a very revealing document of the spirit of the time, the reference to the Mortara affair, which was only implicit in La Tireuse de Cartes, is made thoroughly explicit from the very beginning. And what is also explicit is that these are the words of a Catholic man who is shocked by the Pope's behavior. Now I'm quoting from the preface. In writing La Tireuse de Cartes, did I desire to plead the Mortara family's cause? Clearly I did, the playwright declares at the start of his preface. And then he adds, clarifying his position as a Catholic and as a human being, and here I'm quoting again. Did I seek to produce a diatribe against the Pope or the clergy, against Christianity, which is my faith, or Catholicism, which is my practice? Clearly, I did not. But I am a man, one of those human beings who feel that humanity revolves about the sacred tradition of the family and who place a father under the hand of God. One has a right to speak out loudly in defense of the desecrated home, founded on the child, that great and touching phenomenon of life, maintained by the Father, that most august of authorities, blessed by the Mother, God's most glorious emanation. End of the quotation. What follows these sentences is a series of questions concerning the Pope himself and his behavior in the affair, a behavior that troubles and even shocks, as I said, that this Catholic playwright, who publicly wonders, and here I'm quoting again, is it possible that the Pope, holy man, blessed man, sacred man that he is, might himself be in the forefront of a cruelly inhumane action? Is the cross that he bears not the symbol of brotherhood, the throne that he occupies not the refuge from injustice? How can one protect pity and banal persecution behind this supreme embodiment of divine right? How can one debase that sanctity by dragging it into the list among protests of moral rectitude in a flurry of public conscience, voice quivering with conviction? Do you not feel that here, in the middle of the 19th century, such a stance is tactless, to say the very least? Do you not feel that the flag you're waving might be shamed in defeat and never glorious again in victory? End of the quotation. The questions raised in this public declaration show the shock and embarrassment that the case was producing among liberal Catholics in France and elsewhere, and the negative effect it was having on the image of the papacy. It was in the name of high moral values shared by most human beings at that time that the protest and the plea were elevated to the highest authority of the Catholic world, whose behavior seemed to go against all basic principles of morality and humanity. The conflict was between an illiberal past and the liberal present of Europe after the French Revolution. The battle was, as stated in the very conclusion of Séjour's preface, betwixt, and I'm quoting, betwixt the temptation of despotism and the attractive force of freedom. By asking the Pope whether he did not realize that the flag he was waving might be shamed in defeat and never glorious again in victory, he was warning the supreme Catholic authority with filial solicitude, while anticipating the historical consequences of that action. a serious blow to the moral image of the Church of Rome, and from a political viewpoint, the loss of temporal power that would soon take place. All the spirit of Séjour's prefatory note to La Tireuse des Cartes is that of a person within the Church, and it is as a Catholic that in the last paragraph of his preface, he eventually addresses his plea directly to the Pope, speaking as a spiritual son to his Holy Father. A Pope, he says, and I'm quoting, is father to the faithful, as a father is Pope to his children. I beg you to reflect. Intolerance is a bad counselor, worse still, a deadly one. The intolerant are smitten in advance by God, not only men, but countries as well, indeed, even more so. End of the quotation. Séjour addresses the Pope himself as a spiritual father for Catholics and as the head of a state, and implores him to reflect. I beg you to reflect, in French, réfléchissez, in the name of tolerance and humanity. In his play on stage, Séjour was showing the divided heart of his society, but in his preface, the fire with which he personally fights the battles in favor of the Mortara family's natural rights is evidence of how strongly opposed to the Vatican's action many Catholics were. In my book, Writing for Justice, which has the famous painting by Moritz Oppenheimer that was used for the leaflet of this meeting, which was a painting of 1862, which was re-found again only a few years ago. In this book, I have explored the political context of Séjour's literary work, and I've seen its connections, on the one hand, with the contemporary events of the Italian Risorgimento, and on the other hand, with the broader issue of the multiple struggles for freedom, equal rights, and emancipation that in the mid-19th century were being fought across national borders on both sides of the Atlantic, and that were then reaching their apexes of crisis and resolution in the time that I've called in the chrononym introduced in the subtitle of my book, The Age of Transatlantic Emancipations, plural emancipations. Here, because of our limited time, I will not deal with these larger contextual subjects, since now I would rather move to our contemporary scene and conclude with some remarks that concern our present. It was in the year 2000, in the months preceding the beatification of Pope Pius IX, that thanks to some Catholic journalists, I became aware of the fact that even nowadays, in the present code of canon law promulgated by Pope John Paul II in 1983, there is still a canon, Canon 868, paragraph 2, which makes the secret baptism of children lawful in the eyes of the Church of Rome, even if the child's parents are non-Catholic, and even against the will of the child's parents. Here is the canon, Canon 868, in paragraph 2, in its official English version. An infant of Catholic parents, or even of non-Catholic parents, is baptized licitly in danger of death, even against the will of the parents. Etiam invitis parentibus. Since my discovery of this canon, I've tried to ask the Church to abolish the remnant of a painful past which clashes with all present values of freedom of religion, parents' natural rights, and universal brotherhood. Last week, on November the 20th this year, there was a conference in Milan on this subject, stolen children, contended children, forced baptism in the modern age and contemporary age, organized by the Italian Association Amici dell'Università di Gerusalemme, Friends of the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. There I read a paper titled An Appeal to the Pope, Brotherhood, natural law and the code of canon law, where I addressed directly the Pope, asking him to repeal this canon. I spoke as a Jew and a member of the Mortara family, and as a scholar engaged in intercultural and interreligious dialogue, showing how this kind of law, which was already opposed, if I have understood correctly, by Thomas Aquinas' teaching, and put into question by liberal Catholics at the time of the Mortara affair, seriously contradicts the most important documents of the Second Vatican Council concerning freedom of religion and parents' rights and duties in educating their children, and concerning the idea of universal brotherhood and of God's universal will, salvific will. I also documented the request of a revision of the canon coming from within today's Catholic Church and from contemporary Catholic theologians and canonists who expressed the need for a deeper reflection on the doctrine of original sin and of the absolute need of baptism for salvation. We were together at this conference. And today, from within these important pontifical university institutions, I repeat my appeal to the Pope and my invitation to listen to the many voices asking for a concrete change in the present code of canon law. This request is made in the name of that concept of universal brotherhood, which is invoked by Pope Francis himself in his encyclical Fratelli Tutti, and in the hope of a positive role of religions for the development of a culture for peace in the world. I express my appeal here once again and hope that it can be seriously considered and shared by all of you who are here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professoressa Mortara. Thank you for this fascinating presentation, first of the book of Victor Séjour, La Tireuse de Cartes, which make us also want to read your book, your own book, Writing for Justice. I was listening to you, I was thinking that it is fascinating to see also how these kinds of affairs are also an opportunity for intellectuals, like, if we can call him an intellectual, Victor Séjour. It was a bit the same for the affair Dreyfus, with also which corresponded also with the emergence of the birth, one would say, of the intellectuals as such, like Émile Zola. Concerning your appeal, we of course hope that you will be heard, and I hope that this conference will be also an opportunity to make it more heard, perhaps more successfully than the appeal of Victor Séjour. We have now, before we continue our discussion for the reception, we have some time for some questions. If you have some questions, we have microphones here.
Thank you. I'm Bohumil Petrik. I'm a journalist from Slovakia, ex-Czechoslovakia, here in Rome. And I'm wondering whether in this polemic there was a case used that in the early centuries of the church, the parents themselves, Christian parents, did not want to baptize their children. They waited until, they were, even St. Augustine was his case too, until they were much older, so that with the baptism, all their sins so far would have been forgiven. So there was also this argument that the Christian Catholic parents would wait in favor of their child. So was it used, or it was already in the 19th century something that was out of topic?
We also have a question from the YouTube stream by Professor Benjamin Brown of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, and he asks, is it true that Mortara in his later years was engaged in fighting anti-Semitism?
Perhaps some other questions? Yes.
Massimo, vi faccio vedere.
Thank you very much for your papers. A question for Professor Tapi regarding what was the common interpretation of the writings of Thomas Aquinas at the time of the Mortara case in Rome, if you can give us some insight on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Interestingly enough, at the time of the case, Thomas Aquinas was appealed to by other families of the Jewish community. So the Mortara family is not the only document that reflects an appeal to Aquinas' teaching. Part of this, the importance of this conversation is historical. Is just simply looking at what's the reception history of Thomas's teaching on this matter, and also to deeply understand this case and not to be engaged in a polemic of progressive versus conservative, or liberal era versus a church against freedom or something like that. I think it's important to look at the development of the canon law and the definitions of the church's understanding of baptism. And this takes place in 1747, especially under Pope Benedict the 14th, who passes legislation that regulating baptism in Rome, specifically for the Jewish community of Rome, but also beyond that throughout the Papal States as well. So by the time of the case, the legal apparatus, if you will, and canon law that governs baptism for children of non-Catholic parents, especially Jewish parents, is solidified to the point where an appeal to Thomas's thinking on this matter becomes it's not as important, because the weight of the precedent that had been established under Pope Benedict XIV's legislation was so solid that by the time Pius IX makes his decision in 1858, of course, this is what you would do in a case of unfortunate. The Church thought these baptisms were unfortunate, and even warned against certain things to try to prevent them. Pope Benedict, the whole context of his teaching is in order to prevent situations like this unfolding, but unfortunately Thomas is not part of the discussion, other than being appealed to by certain cases unsuccessfully.
Thank you. Perhaps regarding the question of the fight of the supposed fight of Edgardo Mortara against anti-Semitism.
Well, I don't know of any initiative that he has taken about that, because he had so deeply absorbed the teaching he had received from the church, which had all the possible elements of anti-Semitism within his own soul. He was trying to convert the Jews. He was trying to convert his family. And in that possible memoir, there are all sorts of, it was evil. The Jewish world was evil for him. He recovered the family relations. I can tell you if I want to know about that. Only after the death of Pope Pius IX. In 1878, Pope Pius IX died in 1878, and that's the year when he met his mother again, 20 years later. There is a famous photograph of that meeting. He was already a priest, and at the beginning he tried to convert his family, then, and the family, of course, wanted him, thought he would come back instead. But then, little by little, very soon, they decided not to talk about that, and there was affection again. And he always came to Milan and met his sister, and my father met him many times, and he even went to see him in Belgium. And I can tell you that I have a copy of a book that he gave to to my grandfather when he was a child in the 1880s or early 90s, in the early 90s, when he was the same age as Gardo when he was kidnapped. And the book, it's interesting to see the kind of agreement. The title of the book is in Italian, Chi si aiuta, Dio l'aiuta. Who helps himself, God will help him. So trying, without abolishing the distinction between the religions, saying that if you believe in yourself and work, then God will help you. And that was a kind of middle ground. But I don't know if he felt that there was anti-Semitism. He was living at the end of his life in a convent surrounded by a world of religious people, and he never knew that there was anti-Semitism. He died in the year when, a few months before the arrival of the Nazis, who would have taken him as a Jew. But he was not aware of what was happening around. I don't think so.
Thank you. Professor Cassuto Marcelli.
Penso che la domanda riguardasse l'antisemitismo, razzista, nazista degli ultimi anni della sua vita, la domanda che è stata fatta. Dunque dobbiamo tenere conto che la sua è stata una vita molto lunga. È morto nel 1940, poco prima che il Belgio venisse invaso dai nazisti, quindi poiché nessuno era troppo anziano per essere deportato, sarebbe stato deportato. Quello di cui parlava Elena è l'antigiudaismo tradizionale, quello sicuramente lui ne era impregnato. E va, secondo me, tenuta questa distinzione tra antigiudaismo e antisemitismo, però precisando che sono molto strettamente legati tra loro e l'uno prepara l'altro. Negli stessi anni c'era Jules Isaac, che nascosto nel sud della Francia stava iniziando a lavorare a quello che sarebbe diventato Gesù e Israele, diciamo il testo importante d'inizio del dialogo ebraico-cristiano. E lui che poi ha fondato l'Amitié Judo-Chrétienne de France, e abbiamo qui l'onore di avere il presidente della federazione francese tra noi, ed è lui che il 3 giugno 1960 ha potuto incontrare Giovanni XXIII. E siccome siamo alla vigilia del 60° di Nostre Aetate, la figura di Jules Isaac va ricordata, perché purtroppo uno dei problemi del dialogo interreligioso attuale è che il dialogo ebraico-cristiano si muove in un ambito, il dialogo interreligioso si muove in un altro ambito. E so per esperienza di un amico che in varie parti del mondo quelli che fanno dialogo interreligioso pensano che più o meno sia iniziato con Paolo VI e Nostre Aetate e non sono consapevoli invece dei 20 anni precedenti che hanno portato a Nostre Aetate. Una cosa brevissima ancora su quello che ha detto Elena a proposito di questo appello al Papa. Io nella mia prefazione citavo quei due passi che ho già letto, cioè Giovanni Paolo II, dichiarazione 1980, e Benedetto XVI, dichiarazione del 2018, e concludevo appunto nel 60° anniversario della scomparsa di Jules Isaac e di Giovanni XXIII, l'abrogazione del canone 868, paragrafo 2, sarebbe un bel segno di speranza e una testimonianza di fronte a un'umanità che appare sempre più smarrita e a volte disperata, e non solo. Nella postfazione scritta appunto dall'allora, perché nel frattempo è cambiato priore dei canonici regolari, priore generale, lui dice questo: l'impegno attuale è quello della fraternità universale, in cui ogni essere umano è riconosciuto come creato a immagine e somiglianza di Dio. Tale prospettiva biblica viene ribadita nell'enciclica Fratelli Tutti che Papa Francesco ha pubblicato nel 2020, e cioè la citazione del numero 271 di questa enciclica.
Grazie.
I would like to add, since you mentioned Jules Isaac, I would like to add another name, another important name at that time. Another Jewish scholar, philosopher, Abraham Joshua Heschel, whom I translated into Italian, and I met him, and he has been a reference. And he's the author of an essay called "No Religion is an Island." Very important idea.
Thank you so much. I think we can conclude with this beautiful expression, no religion is an island. And I would like also to thank, first of all, our three speakers, Professoressa Mortara, Professor Casulli, and Professor Tapie, and also all of you who attended this evening. Thank you also for Professor Jean-Ménique Durand, President of the Amitié Judéo-Chrétienne de France, who is here tonight. And a big thank also to the Professor Massimo Gargiulo, and also to the team of the Bea Center. Federica is here? No, she left. And also Professor Dimitrios Keramidas, the scientific coordinator of the Ecumenicum. Thank you. We can now continue our discussion at the reception. It's just we will lead you to very, very near from the aula. Thank you so much, and see you soon.